Let's talk about capital gains tax, because the Australian government is looking at whether or not to hike capital gains tax rates. Specifically, is looking at what's called the long-term capital gains tax discount, which applies if you've held an asset for more than 12 months. It basically says that the capital gains tax rate that would apply is half of your marginal tax rate. So for example, say you're on the top marginal tax rate of 47%. Well, your normal capital gains would be taxed at 47%. But if you hold them for more than a year, that's halved, and they're taxed at 23.5%. At the moment, the government is inquiring into whether or not to remove or at least amend that long-term capital gains tax discount. And to that end, the Senate recently held an inquiry into this, and I appeared at that inquiry. And here's what I had to say.
Mr Humphrey-Jenner, it was remiss of me not to give you an opportunity to make an opening statement, so belatedly I'm going to do that if there's anything you'd like to speak about in relation to your submission to the committee. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, and thanks so much, Senator McKinn, for inviting me to the committee. The crux of this submission is that Australia has one of the highest capital gains tax rates in the world. Australia's top marginal tax rate is 47%, and that applies to short-term capital gains. By contrast, capital gains tax rates in New Zealand, UAE, Singapore, Hong Kong, they're all 0%. Vietnam in 2025 halved its capital gains tax rate to 0%. China, run by the Communist Party, has a capital gains tax rate of 20%. In the United States, the capital gains tax rate caps out at 39% at the federal level, and they also have that 50% long-term capital gains tax discount. So Australia already has an uncompetitively high capital gains tax rate. Now, at the beginning of this inquiry, the capital gains tax discount was being talked about in relation to all assets. However, it's now focused a bit more on housing. Hiking capital gains tax rates for all assets is a particular problem because it would render Australia uncompetitive relative to the myriad other economies where one could invest in. But also, when it relates to housing, it also creates a problem. And there's a few aspects of this. First, if you hike capital gains tax rates, it's implausible that supply would improve. There's simply no universe in which hiking capital gains tax rates would increase supply through new construction. However, in fact, it could get worse. And that's because anyone who is looking to buy a particular property, well, they're going to look at the after-tax cash flows they might generate from it. What this means is that new builds are going to become relatively less attractive. And this is the case even if the CGT discount only applies to new builds, because they're going to consider what the buyer of their property is going to pay for it. Not only that, holders of property, they're not necessarily going to exit the market. What they're going to do is they're going to hold onto the property for longer, and then they'll get their gains out by borrowing against that property. So, for example, they buy a property and they realize its equity is increased. But because the capital gains tax rate is high, they'll go to the bank and they'll borrow money mortgaged against that property. And that would enable them to get some cash out and liquidity without having to incur the capital gains tax rate. And this is the problem that is going to be exacerbated if we hike capital gains taxes. And both of these factors would reduce the amount of supply available to potential owner-occupiers. It would also deter turnover, like I've indicated, thereby potentially reducing capital gains tax revenue due to the behavioural impact. But also, and this is something that hasn't been discussed so much, is going to impact stamp duty, because state governments rely on stamp duty for a good portion of their revenue. So if you get less turnover, you get less stamp duty, and state governments need to work out how to balance their books. Ultimately, hiking capital gains tax rates would make Australia a less competitive and less attractive place for capital. It would not improve supply, and potentially is going to worsen liquidity in the market. So in fact, I would encourage the committee to look at reducing capital gains tax, or alternatively increasing the capital gains tax discount, although my preference would be for reducing capital gains tax across the board.
Thanks, Mr Humphrey-Jenner. Could I ask you whether you think reducing the capital gains tax discount would change the percentage of the housing stock owned by owner-occupiers as opposed to investors?
There are multiple levers involved in this, and we're sort of looking at how to model this. So in many ways, there is, I guess, a degree of ambiguity about it. The reason I say that is we've got two countervailing factors. Firstly, if you increase capital gains tax rates, it would potentially make a property incrementally less attractive to investors, right? Secondly, on the other hand, those investors are going to be less likely to sell. And we need to consider when modelling this, the ability of those investors to just hold onto the property forever and then just borrow money to get liquidity. Because if your equities increase, you go to the bank, you get a mortgage, and you say, well, I want to borrow 80% of my property, which is now increased in value. You get the money out, and you do that instead of selling. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, it's less attractive, therefore you get fewer investors. Likely it probably would create a bit of a shift, maybe a minor shift toward owner-occupiers. But like I've said, you've got the supply issues, and you've also got the behavioural impacts on investors.
All right, thanks. That's helpful. Mr. Reardon, you spoke about, in one of your earlier answers, the people who build the houses. Just let me ask you this. How is it fair that we've got a tax system in Australia where the people who actually do build houses, like the carpenters, the bricklayers, the plumbers, the electricians, the labourers, how is it fair that they're going to pay about twice the tax compared to someone who earns or makes the same amount of money sitting on the couch flipping investment properties? How's that fair?
Sorry, I'm not following your question there. You mean if an owner-occupier buys a house and doesn't pay capital gains tax?
I mean that someone who goes to work for a living in this country doesn't get a 50% discount on their tax. They pay
so they don't pay
tax.
any capital gains tax?
No. Well, that would depend on their circumstances, obviously.
Well, no, if you're an owner-occupier, you don't pay any capital gains tax.
I'm talking about people who go to work.
People that go to work.
And that's,
So an owner-occupier doesn't pay capital gains tax?
I'll run through the question for you again to try and make it clear for you. The people that build the housing stock in this country, the plumbers, the carpenters, the bricklayers, the electricians, they go to work every day to earn a living.
Yes.
And if that's their only form of income, they pay about twice the tax than someone who makes the same amount on their income as someone who makes the same amount of money flipping investment properties. So how is that fair?
Just so I understand your question, you're saying income tax is higher than the capital gains tax?
Well, because of the capital gains tax discount, yes, it is.
Senator, we're not here to defend investors. Our goal is to increase housing supply, to keep rental prices down, to keep house prices down. What we don't want to have happen out of this is to get more taxes on housing, which, as everybody else has here explained, you can't raise more revenue from housing and get more homes built. That just does not make sense. So, I think your question is coming at what is the relative merit of capital gains tax versus income tax. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm asking simply, I mean, you're here defending the current capital gains tax concessions and the current arrangements. That's very obvious.
So I think
you've been very clear about that, and thank you for being so clear. So you're here defending the current capital gains tax discount. I'm making the point that people who go to work to earn a living in this country are paying twice the tax on their income than someone who is making the same amount of money flipping investment properties. That is patently unfair, is it not? And you're defending that because you're defending the concession that allows that situation to exist.
I think we've just heard our colleague here, Mark Humphrey-Jenner, explain that capital gains tax in Australia is significantly higher than it is elsewhere in the world. Previously, we heard Treasury say that you need to compare capital gains tax to other taxes on savings. Our context here is don't increase the taxes on housing.
All right. Mr. Humphrey-Jenner, did you have a reflection on my question?
You're quite right that generally someone who's working as a PAYG employee, they'll typically be paying a much higher tax rate, right? Like in my work at UNSW, I'm on a much higher tax rate than the long-term capital gains tax discount. Now, I have two components to my answer to this. Firstly, I generally agree with Paul Keating, who inflected that an income tax rate, in his case, he said above 39%, is confiscatory. So I would actually argue the income tax rate is too high, and that is a problem there. But also the second aspect of it is that I'd actually argue that the investment, whether it's in an investment property or in shares, is a way for that carpenter, that plumber, that electrician to get ahead. So they might be working themselves potentially to death, depending on the industry. Silicosis, for example, is a thing. The way to be able to achieve a semblance of freedom is to not have to do that work. So the carpenter might be working maybe 10, 12 hours a day, but then they can put some money aside so they don't have to do that. And I'd actually argue the investment is how they achieve a degree of freedom rather than having to work themselves to death, either for the government or for their employer. And hence why the CGT is in fact beneficial to many of those individuals if they invest the money appropriately.
So you can see from my appearance at the inquiry, I was not a fan of hiking capital gains tax and not a fan of removing that long-term capital gains tax discount. And indeed, I argue that capital gains should be having a lower tax rate than they currently have. After all, the UAE, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong all have 0% capital gains tax. In the United States, capital gains are taxed at the marginal tax rate, but at the federal level that caps out at 39%, and you also get that 50% long-term capital gains tax discount. In the United Kingdom, where they hiked capital gains taxes to 24%, that actually resulted in a reduction in capital gains tax revenue, as people traded less and left the country. So hiking capital gains taxes is not going to be beneficial. It is not going to help out individuals. It is unclear it would actually raise more government revenue, and it is certainly not going to help housing affordability or housing supply. But if you've got any thoughts about it, you can let me know that in the comments below.